Margaret stood in the corner of the grand living room, quietly refilling crystal glasses and removing empty appetizer plates, while Richard's family held court near the marble fireplace. The funeral reception was in full swing, but she felt like a ghost moving through her own home. Where are you watching this story unfold from today? I'd love to hear in the comments which state or country you're tuning in from, because this tale of hidden ownership and family greed might hit differently, depending on where you call home. Eleanor Whitmore, Richard's 72-year-old mother, accepted condolences from the steady stream of visitors with the practiced grace of someone born into old money. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed despite the day's emotional toll, and her black Chanel suit probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She dabbed her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief while speaking in hushed tones about her dear departed son. Margaret had been married to Richard for 30 years, yet Eleanor still introduced her to newcomers as simply Richard's wife, never bothering to mention her name. The slight wasn't lost on Margaret, but she'd grown accustomed to such treatment over the decades. She'd learned long ago that fighting these small battles only made the war more difficult. James Whitmore, Richard's younger brother, commanded attention near the bay windows overlooking the estate grounds. At 45, he possessed the same commanding presence that had made Richard successful in business, though James had never quite achieved his older brother's level of success. He wore his grief like an expensive suit, well-tailored but somehow not quite authentic. Margaret was about to clear a side table when she noticed the conversation between James and their cousin Frederick had shifted to hushed, urgent tones. She moved closer, ostensibly to straighten some flowers, and caught fragments of their discussion. James spoke with barely contained excitement beneath his somber exterior. The estate is worth at least $12 million, maybe 15 with the current market. Mother's already spoken with Harrison about the trust documentation. Margaret will be taken care of, naturally, but she'll need to understand her new circumstances. Frederick nodded sympathetically. Poor thing probably doesn't understand the first thing about managing wealth of this magnitude. Best thing for everyone if the family handles the complex financial matters. She can have the guest cottage and a reasonable allowance. Margaret's hands stilled on the flower arrangement. She'd been arranging flowers in this very vase since 1994, back when the original owners were facing bankruptcy and the estate was nothing more than a crumbling monument to faded glory. But James and Frederick continued their planning as if she were simply another piece of furniture to be relocated. Eleanor's voice carried across the room as she addressed a group of Richard's former business associates. Margaret was such a devoted wife, bless her heart. Richard always said she had simple tastes, coming from that little farming town in Nebraska. She'll need our guidance now more than ever. This house and its responsibilities are rather overwhelming for someone of her background. The farming town comment stung, though not for the reason Eleanor intended. Margaret had indeed grown up in rural Nebraska, but she'd left at 17 with a full scholarship to Northwestern University Law School. She'd graduated summa cum laude and spent 5 years at Chicago's most prestigious real estate law firm before meeting Richard at a charity gala in 1993. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, Richard's longtime physician, approached Margaret with genuine warmth. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Margaret. Richard spoke about you constantly during his treatments. He was so proud of how you'd built your life together." Margaret smiled gratefully. Dr. Hendricks was one of the few people who truly understood the depth of her marriage to Richard. "Thank you, Patricia. That means everything to me." As Dr. Hendricks moved away, Margaret noticed Eleanor watching their interaction with thinly veiled annoyance. Eleanor had never appreciated anyone treating Margaret as Richard's equal rather than his fortunate charity case. The afternoon wore on with Margaret serving as an invisible hostess while the family discussed their plans with increasing boldness. She overheard James on the phone with someone named Harrison, presumably the family lawyer Eleanor had mentioned. James spoke in what he probably thought was a discreet whisper. "Yes, the funeral is today. We'll need to handle the transition smoothly. Margaret's a sweet woman, but she's not equipped for this level of responsibility. The family needs to step in immediately to protect everyone's interests." Margaret paused in her clearing to listen more carefully. James continued his conversation near the French doors leading to the garden. "Mother thinks we should give her a few days to process everything, then sit down and explain the situation. Obviously, she'll want what's best for the family legacy. Richard would have wanted the estate to remain in Whitmore hands for future generations. By evening, most guests had departed, leaving only the immediate family and a few close friends. Margaret had spent hours ensuring everyone was comfortable, but now exhaustion was setting in. She'd been awake for nearly 20 hours, having risen early to coordinate with the caterers and florists. Eleanor approached her as Margaret gathered the last of the serving dishes. "Dear, you must be simply exhausted. Why don't you rest tomorrow while James and I handle some of the business matters? There's quite a lot of paperwork to sort through, and you shouldn't burden yourself with such complications during your grief." Margaret looked up from the crystal glasses she was carefully packing. "I appreciate your concern, Eleanor, but I'll be fine. Richard and I handled our affairs together. I know exactly what needs to be done." Eleanor's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, dear, but there are family considerations that go beyond what you and Richard discussed privately. The estate has been in Whitmore hands for generations. There are traditions and responsibilities that require careful thought." James joined them, still holding his phone from another call. "Margaret, Harrison will be coming by tomorrow afternoon to review some documents with us. Nothing urgent, just estate planning formalities. You might want to have your own representation present." Margaret felt a chill run through her despite the warm evening. Your own representation. As if she were already being positioned as an outsider to her own home. "I'm sure that won't be necessary, James. Richard and I were very thorough in our planning." James exchanged a meaningful glance with his mother. "Of course you were, Margaret. But these situations can be more complex than they initially appear. It's always better to have professional guidance to ensure everything is handled properly." After the last guests departed, Margaret stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of the day's gathering. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts, stopping at a name she hadn't called in over 5 years. Rebecca Chun, senior partner, Chun Martinez and Associates. Margaret's finger hovered over the call button. Rebecca had been her mentor at the firm, the woman who'd taught her everything about real estate law and property rights. They'd remained friends even after Margaret's retirement, though their contact had dwindled to holiday cards and occasional lunch meetings. Instead of making the call immediately, Margaret walked through the house one more time, turning off lights and checking locks. Every room held memories of the life she and Richard had built together. But tonight those memories were overshadowed by the family's barely concealed plans for her future. In the master bedroom, she opened the wall safe hidden behind Richard's portrait. Inside, among insurance policies and jewelry, was a folder marked personal documents. Margaret pulled out a thick sheaf of papers and spread them across the bed. Property deeds, tax records, and correspondence dating back to 1994. She traced her finger along the signature line of the original purchase agreement. Margaret Elizabeth Hartwell, she'd signed it 6 months before she became Margaret Whitmore. The house had been hers before she'd ever met Richard, purchased with her savings from 5 years of corporate law practice. Tomorrow would bring James and Eleanor's version of the truth. But tonight, Margaret sat surrounded by the real truth, planning her response to a family who'd forgotten she was far more than they'd ever imagined. Margaret pulled into the circular driveway after her trip to the grocery store, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she noticed the unfamiliar locksmith van parked near the front entrance. 2 men in work uniforms were bent over the massive oak doors of what had been her home for 30 years, their tools glinting in the afternoon sunlight. Eleanor stood on the front steps directing the operation with the authority of someone who believed she owned the property. She wore her black funeral dress from the day before, but her grief had been replaced by something harder, more calculating. James paced nearby, speaking urgently into his cell phone while gesturing toward the house. Margaret parked her car and approached the scene with growing unease. The locksmith closest to her looked up apologetically. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but you'll need to speak with the family about access. We're changing all the locks per their instructions." Eleanor turned at the sound of Margaret's voice, her expression shifting from authoritative to coldly dismissive. "Margaret, dear, we were just handling some security updates. Nothing for you to worry about." Margaret felt her stomach drop as the implications became clear. Security updates that didn't include her suggested something far more sinister than simple home maintenance. "What kind of security updates require changing the locks, Eleanor?" James ended his phone call and joined them at the front entrance. Margaret, we need to discuss some important matters regarding the estate. Why don't we sit down and go over everything calmly? The second locksmith finished his work and tested the new deadbolt with a fresh set of keys. All set, ma'am, he said to Eleanor, handing her a small key ring. The old locks are completely disabled. Margaret reached for the keys automatically, but Eleanor pulled them back with a tight smile. Actually, Margaret, that's what we need to discuss. There have been some developments regarding property ownership that affect your living situation here. A moving truck turned into the driveway, followed by a sedan that Margaret recognized as belonging to Harrison Blackwell, the family's longtime attorney. The pieces of Eleanor and James's plan were falling into place with military precision, and Margaret realized she'd walked into an ambush. James gestured toward the moving truck with manufactured sympathy. Margaret, we've arranged for your belongings to be carefully packed and stored while we sort out the estate matters. It's really for everyone's protection during this complicated time. Eleanor stepped closer, her voice taking on a patronizing tone that Margaret had endured for 3 decades. Dear, you must understand that this property has been in the Whitmore family for generations. With Richard gone, certain legal realities need to be addressed. Margaret watched in growing horror as the movers began unloading boxes and packing supplies. You're evicting me? The day after my husband's funeral? Harrison Blackwell emerged from his sedan carrying a thick briefcase and an expression of professional regret. Margaret, I'm so sorry about the timing, but legal matters don't wait for grief to subside. We need to discuss your status regarding this property. James produced an official-looking document from his jacket pocket. Margaret, this is a formal notice requiring you to vacate the premises within 24 hours. The estate trustees have determined that your residence here was dependent on your marriage to Richard. Eleanor's mask of sympathy slipped entirely. Margaret, surely you understand that this house belongs to the family trust. Richard may have allowed you certain privileges during the marriage, but those arrangements died with him. Margaret felt 30 years of careful politeness evaporating in the face of their calculated cruelty. I'd like to see the property deed, please. If you're making ownership claims, you should have documentation to support them. Harrison Blackwell cleared his throat nervously. Mrs. Whitmore, the family has provided me with all relevant documentation. The trust ownership is quite clear. James waved dismissively. Margaret, you wouldn't understand the legal complexities involved. This is exactly why families maintain professional attorneys to handle these matters properly. The head mover approached with a clipboard and apologetic expression. Excuse me, ma'am, but we'll need access to begin packing the personal items. Should we start with the master bedroom? Margaret felt a surge of panic as strangers prepared to rifle through her most private belongings. You have no right to enter my home without my permission. Eleanor's laugh was sharp and humorless. Your home? Margaret, dear, I think you've misunderstood your position here for quite some time. James pulled out his phone and began dialing. If you're going to be difficult about this, Margaret, I can call the police to assist with the transition. But I'd rather handle this as a family matter. Margaret's legal training began to override her emotional shock. James, I want to see the exact documentation you're using to support these ownership claims. And I want it now. Harrison Blackwell opened his briefcase reluctantly. Mrs. Whitmore, the family has provided me with deed documentation showing clear Whitmore family ownership dating back several generations. Eleanor moved closer to Margaret, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. Listen carefully, dear. You have 24 hours to gather your personal belongings and leave quietly. We're prepared to be generous with a small settlement if you cooperate. Margaret felt a familiar coldness settle over her, the same professional detachment she'd cultivated during her years practicing law. Eleanor, I think you're making a very serious mistake. But please, continue with your plans. James gestured impatiently to the movers. Gentlemen, please begin with the personal items in the master bedroom. Be careful with everything, but we need to work efficiently. The movers hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the family dynamics playing out around them. Ma'am, the team leader said to Margaret, are you okay with us packing your belongings? Margaret's smile was cold and calculating. Actually, I'd prefer that you wait a few minutes. I have a phone call to make first. Eleanor's confidence wavered slightly. Who are you calling, Margaret? This is a private family matter. Margaret pulled out her cell phone and scrolled through her contacts with deliberate slowness. Just an old colleague who might be interested in the legal issues we're discussing here. James stepped forward aggressively. Margaret, any legal representation you hire will simply confirm what we're telling you. Save yourself the expense and embarrassment. Margaret found the contact she was looking for and pressed the call button. Rebecca? It's Margaret Whitmore. I need your help with a property dispute that's developed rather suddenly. Harrison Blackwell's face went pale at the mention of Rebecca's name. He clearly recognized the reputation of Chun Martinez and Associates, even if the family didn't understand the significance. Eleanor grabbed Margaret's arm. Who is Rebecca? You don't have lawyer friends, Margaret. You're a housewife from Nebraska. Margaret's voice carried 30 years of suppressed legal authority as she continued her phone conversation. Rebecca, I'm at the estate and Richard's family is claiming ownership based on some questionable documentation. Could you bring the team down here this afternoon? James tried to grab the phone from Margaret's hand. This is ridiculous. You're calling some random attorney to delay the inevitable. Margaret stepped back, completing her call with professional calm. Thank you, Rebecca. I'll see you in an hour. Please bring David and Thomas and the full property litigation kit. Eleanor's aristocratic composure cracked slightly. Margaret, you're being dramatic about a simple estate matter. There's no need for outside attorneys. Margaret looked around at the locksmith van, the moving truck, and the family attorney with his suspicious documents. Eleanor, I think there's every need for outside attorneys, especially ones who specialize in property fraud. Harrison Blackwell was sweating despite the cool afternoon air. Mrs. Whitmore, perhaps we should postpone the moving arrangements until we can review all documentation more thoroughly. James exploded with frustration. This is our family home. We're not going to be intimidated by some housewife hiring a lawyer to delay estate proceedings. Margaret's smile was razor-sharp. James, I think you're about to discover that your assumptions about this housewife were dangerously incorrect. Eleanor tried to regain control of the situation. Margaret, whatever game you think you're playing, it needs to stop. We have legal documentation proving ownership. Margaret walked to her car and retrieved her purse, pulling out a manila folder she'd been carrying since the night before. Eleanor, I have some documentation of my own that might interest your attorney. Harrison Blackwell accepted the folder with trembling hands, his confidence evaporating as he recognized official property records that contradicted everything the family had told him. The sound of multiple car engines announced the arrival of Margaret's reinforcements. 3 Blacktown cars were making their way up the circular drive, their polished surfaces reflecting the afternoon sun like armor. James stared at the approaching vehicles with growing panic. Who the hell did you call, Margaret? Margaret's voice carried the authority she'd buried for 30 years of marriage. James, I called the people who are going to explain to you exactly who owns this property, and I think you're going to be very surprised by what they have to say. Eleanor clutched her new house keys like talismans, but her confidence was crumbling as professional-looking individuals emerged from the town cars. Margaret, this isn't how family matters are supposed to be handled. Margaret watched her former legal colleagues approach with satisfaction. Eleanor, you're absolutely right. This isn't a family matter anymore. This is a property dispute, and I intend to win it. Margaret had barely finished her morning coffee when the sound of car engines drew her to the front window. 3 Blacktown cars were making their way up the circular drive, their polished surfaces gleaming in the late morning sunlight. She recognized the vehicles immediately as the type her old law firm used for important client meetings. Eleanor and James had arrived an hour earlier, along with their family attorney Harrison Blackwell. They'd made themselves comfortable in the library, spreading documents across Richard's mahogany desk like generals planning a campaign. Margaret could hear their muffled voices through the closed doors, occasionally punctuated by Harrison's nervous laughter. The lead town car stopped directly in front of the main entrance. Margaret watched as a woman in an impeccably tailored navy suit stepped out, followed by 2 men carrying leather briefcases. Even from a distance, Margaret could see Rebecca Chen's distinctive silver-streaked black hair and confident bearing. Rebecca had mentored Margaret during her years at Chun Martinez and Associates, teaching her the intricacies of real estate law that had made Margaret one of the firm's most valuable assets. They'd worked together on deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but Margaret had walked away from it all when she married Richard, choosing love over career advancement. The doorbell's melodic chimes echoed through the foyer. Margaret smoothed her black dress and walked to answer it, aware that Eleanor and James would be listening from the library. She opened the heavy oak door to find Rebecca standing there with David Martinez, the firm's founding partner, and Thomas Chun, Rebecca's nephew and the firm's current managing partner. Rebecca Chun smiled warmly, but her eyes held a steely determination that Margaret remembered from their most challenging cases. "Hello, Margaret. I came as soon as I received your message. I'm so sorry about Richard." Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her. She'd made the call at 3 in the morning, leaving a brief voicemail about needing legal representation for estate matters. She hadn't expected Rebecca to drop everything and drive from Chicago with the firm's top partners. "Thank you for coming, Rebecca. I wasn't sure you'd remember our old arrangement." Rebecca stepped into the foyer, followed by David and Thomas. "Remember? Margaret, you were one of the finest real estate attorneys I ever trained. Some arrangements transcend retirement." The library door opened abruptly, and James emerged, his face showing surprise and confusion. He'd clearly expected to hear Margaret greeting a single local attorney, not a team of what were obviously high-powered legal professionals. "Margaret, you didn't mention you'd hired representation." Margaret turned to face James with Rebecca at her side. "I thought it would be prudent, given the complexity of estate matters you mentioned yesterday." Eleanor appeared behind James, taking in the scene with growing alarm. Her eyes moved from Rebecca's expensive suit to David's Italian leather briefcase to Thomas's Harvard Law School cufflinks. "These aren't local attorneys," she said, more statement than question. Rebecca extended her hand to Eleanor with professional courtesy. "Rebecca Chun, senior partner at Chun Martinez and Associates. I'll be representing Mrs. Whitmore in all estate-related matters." Harrison Blackwell had followed Eleanor and James from the library, and Margaret watched his face change as he recognized the firm name. Chun Martinez and Associates was legendary in Chicago real estate circles, known for handling billion-dollar commercial deals and protecting high-net-worth clients from exactly the kind of family disputes that were about to unfold. Harrison cleared his throat nervously. "I wasn't aware Mrs. Whitmore had connections to Chun Martinez. This is quite unexpected." David Martinez spoke for the first time, his voice carrying decades of courtroom authority. "Margaret was one of our most valued associates before her retirement. When she calls, we respond." Eleanor's composure began to crack as the implications became clear. "Margaret, I don't understand. You never mentioned being an attorney. Richard never said anything about your legal background." Margaret had dreaded this conversation for 30 years. She'd buried her legal career so completely that even Richard's family had forgotten she'd ever had a profession beyond being his devoted wife. "I was a real estate attorney for 5 years before I married Richard. I specialized in commercial property law and estate planning." James stepped forward, his earlier confidence evaporating. "But you never practiced law during your marriage. You were just Richard's wife." Rebecca's eyes flashed with barely contained anger at the dismissive tone. "Just Richard's wife? Mr. Whitmore, your sister-in-law graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern Law and was being considered for partner when she chose to support her husband's career instead." Thomas opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. Margaret maintained her bar certification throughout her marriage. She consulted on several major acquisitions for our firm over the years, including the Pemberton Tower deal that you might recognize from the business news. Harrison's face had gone pale. The Pemberton Tower acquisition had been worth $400 million, one of the largest commercial real estate deals in Chicago's history. Everyone in the legal community knew about that case. Eleanor sank into one of the foyer chairs, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "Why didn't you tell us? All these years, we thought you were just a simple girl from Nebraska who got lucky marrying Richard." Margaret felt 30 years of suppressed frustration rising to the surface. "I tried to tell you many times, Eleanor, but you preferred to see me as Richard's fortunate charity case. It was easier than acknowledging that your son had married his intellectual equal." Rebecca gestured toward the library where the family's documents were spread across the desk. "Now, if we could review the estate documentation you mentioned, I'd like to understand exactly what claims are being made regarding property ownership." Harrison looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. "The documentation is somewhat preliminary. We haven't completed a full title search yet." David Martinez's expression grew stern. "You haven't completed a title search? Mr. Blackwell, I trust you're not advising your clients to make ownership claims without proper due diligence." James rallied, trying to regain control of the situation. The estate has been in the Whitmore family for generations. The documentation is merely a formality to transfer everything into the proper trust structure. Rebecca's smile was razor-sharp. Generations, you say? That's interesting, because I seem to recall Margaret mentioning she purchased this property in 1994, before her marriage to Richard. The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor's mouth opened and closed without making a sound. James looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Harrison began frantically shuffling through his papers, as if he could somehow find evidence to contradict what Rebecca had just said. Margaret walked to the library and retrieved a manila folder from her purse. Inside were copies of documents she'd been carrying since the previous night, waiting for exactly this moment. Rebecca accepted the folder and began examining its contents while the Whitmore family watched in growing horror. The original purchase agreement, signed by Margaret Elizabeth Hartwell in 1994, was crystal clear. She'd bought the property outright for $8.2 million, using savings from her law practice and a trust fund inheritance from her grandmother. Richard's name appeared nowhere on the deed. Rebecca looked up from the documents with satisfaction. It appears Margaret owned this estate 6 months before she even met Richard. The property was her wedding gift to him, though she retained legal ownership. Thomas was examining additional documents from the folder. There's also documentation showing Margaret paid for all major renovations and improvements over the past 30 years. The property's value increased largely due to her investments. Eleanor finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. But Richard always said this was the family estate. We've been living here for 30 years thinking it was ours. Margaret's voice remained calm but firm. You've been living here because I allowed it, Eleanor. As my guests. Richard knew the truth, but he preferred to let his family maintain their illusions about inherited wealth. David Martinez closed his briefcase with finality. I think we need to have a very serious conversation about attempted fraud, Mr. Blackwell. Your clients have been making ownership claims about property that belongs entirely to my client. Harrison was sweating profusely now, realizing his firm's reputation was in jeopardy. There must be some misunderstanding. I was told the family had clear ownership. Rebecca's tone brooked no argument. The only misunderstanding, Mr. Blackwell, is how you could file preliminary estate documents without conducting basic due diligence. This is going to require immediate correction. Rebecca spread the estate documents across the library's conference table with methodical precision, her legal team flanking her like generals preparing for battle. Margaret sat quietly in Richard's leather chair, watching 30 years of family assumptions crumble under professional scrutiny. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows illuminated every page as Rebecca's team began their systematic demolition of the Whitmore family's claims. Thomas opened his laptop and connected it to the portable scanner David had brought from their car. We'll need to digitize everything for our records, he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to handling multimillion-dollar disputes. Eleanor paced nervously behind the sofa, where James sat rigid with tension. This is our family home, she declared, her voice rising with each word. We've lived here for 30 years. You can't just come in here and turn our lives upside down with paperwork. Rebecca didn't look up from the deed she was examining under a magnifying glass. Mrs. Whitmore, paperwork is what establishes legal ownership. And this particular piece of paperwork has some very interesting modifications. Harrison Blackwell leaned forward anxiously. What kind of modifications? David Martinez pointed to several lines on the deed with a silver pen. Someone has used correction fluid to alter the original purchaser's name. Very crudely done, actually. You can see the texture difference under proper lighting. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. She'd never seen that version of the deed before. The documents in her personal files were pristine originals, but Harrison had apparently been working from altered copies. Where did you get this version of the deed, Harrison? Harrison's hands trembled slightly as he rifled through his briefcase. James provided it to me last week. He said it came from the family's safe deposit box at First National Bank. James shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger. Are you suggesting I forged documents? This is outrageous. I demand that you people leave my family's home immediately. Rebecca's voice remained deadly calm. Mr. Whitmore, this is not your family's home. That's exactly the point we're establishing here. And yes, Someone has definitely altered this deed in an attempt to change the recorded owner from Margaret Elizabeth Hartwell to Richard James Whitmore. Thomas held up his phone, showing a photograph he'd just taken of the document under magnification. The correction fluid is clearly visible here and here. This would never hold up in any court proceeding. Eleanor's pacing grew more agitated. This is impossible. Richard inherited this house from his grandfather. The family has records going back to 1962 when grandfather Whitmore purchased the estate. Margaret reached into her purse and withdrew another folder, this one bound with a red ribbon. Eleanor, your grandfather never owned this property. He rented it from 1962 to 1994 from the Morrison family. When the Morrisons faced bankruptcy, I purchased it at auction. David accepted the folder from Margaret and began examining its contents. Here are the original auction records, the bankruptcy court filings, and the complete chain of title going back to 1891. The Whitmore family never held legal ownership at any point. Harrison was sweating profusely now, realizing the magnitude of his error. But the trust documents James showed me clearly indicated family ownership spanning generations. Rebecca's laugh was sharp and humorless. Mr. Blackwell, those trust documents are worthless. You cannot create a trust for property you don't own. Every document your firm has filed on behalf of the Whitmore family regarding this estate is based on fraudulent information. James pulled out his cell phone with shaking hands. I'm calling the police. This is harassment, and I want these people removed from our property immediately. Margaret stood up slowly, her composure unchanged throughout the growing chaos. James, you're welcome to call the police. But you should know that Sheriff Thompson and I have known each other for 15 years. I handled the legal work when the county purchased land for the new courthouse. Eleanor stopped pacing and stared at Margaret in disbelief. You worked with the sheriff's department? Margaret nodded calmly. I provided pro bono legal services to several county projects during my marriage. Sheriff Thompson will remember me quite well, especially since I helped his department avoid a lawsuit over improper land acquisition procedures. Thomas continued scanning documents while the family drama unfolded around him. These auction records are fascinating, he said, holding up a thick legal document. Margaret paid $8.2 million cash for a property that had been appraised at $12 million. The Morrison family was desperate to avoid complete financial ruin. David examined the payment records with professional interest. Margaret essentially saved the Morrison family from total bankruptcy while acquiring a valuable estate at below market value. Brilliant legal maneuvering. James completed his call and snapped his phone shut. Sheriff Thompson will be here within the hour. We'll see how confident you are when law enforcement arrives. Rebecca gathered the altered deed and placed it in a clear protective sleeve. Mr. Whitmore, when Sheriff Thompson arrives, I'll be very interested to hear his thoughts on these document alterations. Tampering with property deeds is a felony in this state. Harrison looked like he might faint. Document tampering? I had no idea these papers had been altered. James assured me they were family originals. Eleanor finally sank into her chair, the weight of 30 years of assumptions crushing down upon her. But if Margaret owned the house all along, why did she let us believe otherwise? Margaret's voice carried decades of patient resignation. Because Richard asked me to, Eleanor. He wanted his family to feel secure and important. I agreed to maintain the fiction because I loved him. But Richard is gone now, and I won't be treated like a tenant in my own home. Thomas looked up from his scanning. There's another interesting document here. A letter from Margaret to Richard dated December 1994, 6 months after their wedding. She's formally gifting him lifetime residence rights while retaining full ownership. David read over Thomas's shoulder. She essentially gave Richard a life estate while protecting her own investment. Very sophisticated legal planning for someone so young. Rebecca smiled with professional admiration. Margaret always was 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. I should have known she'd have contingency plans. James was pacing now, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. This can't be happening. Our entire family legacy is built on this estate. Margaret's tone remained gentle but firm. James, your family legacy was built on Richard's business success and your mother's charitable work. This house was just a building. I maintained it and improved it because I loved your brother, but it was always mine. The sound of gravel crunching under tires announced Sheriff Thompson's arrival. Eleanor clutched her pearls while James straightened his tie. both preparing for what they assumed would be their vindication. Harrison gathered his papers with nervous energy, still trying to process how badly he'd misunderstood the situation. Rebecca organized her documents with calm efficiency. "Mr. Whitmore, when the sheriff reviews these materials, I think you'll find that the only crime being investigated today will be the alteration of official property records." Margaret walked to the library window and watched as Sheriff Thompson's patrol car stopped behind the town cars. She'd known Bill Thompson since he was a rookie deputy, back when she'd helped the county navigate complex property acquisitions. He was a fair man who followed evidence rather than emotions. The doorbell chimed, and Margaret moved toward the foyer. "I'll let Sheriff Thompson in. I imagine he'll want to hear everyone's version of events before drawing any conclusions." Thomas finished scanning the last document and closed his laptop. "We have everything we need to establish clear ownership and document the fraudulent alterations. This should be straightforward from a legal standpoint." Eleanor grabbed James's arm as Margaret left to answer the door. "What have you done to us, James? How could you not know the truth about property ownership?" James's voice was barely a whisper. "I trusted what Father told me. He always said Grandfather bought this place, and it would be ours someday. I never questioned it." Rebecca packed her briefcase with satisfaction. "Mr. Whitmore, that's the difference between assumptions and legal verification. Your family lived comfortably on assumptions for 30 years. Today, legal reality takes precedence." Sheriff Bill Thompson removed his hat as he entered the library, his weathered face taking in the tense scene before him. Margaret had known him since his rookie days 15 years ago, back when she'd helped the county navigate a complex land dispute that could have cost taxpayers millions. His presence immediately shifted the room's dynamics, as everyone recognized the authority he represented. "Bill, thank you for coming," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding her. "I'm afraid we have a situation involving altered property documents and disputed ownership claims." Sheriff Thompson nodded respectfully. "Margaret, I got the call about a property dispute." James here seemed pretty agitated on the phone. He gestured toward James, who was standing rigid near the fireplace. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. James stepped forward, trying to regain some composure. "Sheriff, these people are harassing my family in our own home. They're making outrageous claims about property ownership based on forged documents." Rebecca Chen stood and extended her hand to Sheriff Thompson. "Sheriff, I'm Rebecca Chen from Chen Martinez and Associates. We're here representing Mrs. Margaret Whitmore in estate matters. What we've discovered are alterations to official property deeds that appear designed to defraud the rightful owner." Sheriff Thompson accepted a chair that David Martinez offered him and pulled out a small notebook. "Why don't we start from the beginning? James, you called saying there was harassment and trespassing?" James's voice cracked slightly. "These lawyers showed up claiming Margaret owns our family estate. They're saying my grandfather never owned this property, which is impossible. We have documents proving ownership going back decades." Sheriff Thompson looked to Margaret. "What's your position on this, Margaret?" Margaret opened her purse and withdrew the red ribbon-bound folder she'd been carrying since the night before. "Bill, I purchased this property at bankruptcy auction in March 1994. I have all the original documentation, including the cashier's check receipt for $8.2 million. Eleanor gasped from her position near the window. $8.2 million? Where would you get that kind of money? Margaret's voice remained calm. "From my trust fund inheritance and savings from 5 years practicing law at Chen Martinez and Associates. I was a real estate attorney specializing in commercial property acquisitions." Sheriff Thompson examined the auction documents with the careful attention of someone who'd seen his share of property disputes. "These look legitimate to me. The county recorder's seal is authentic, and the signatures match what's on file downtown." Harrison Blackwell cleared his throat nervously. "Sheriff, my clients provided me with deed documentation showing family ownership. I had no reason to question their authenticity." Rebecca handed Sheriff Thompson the altered deed in its protective sleeve. "This is what Mr. Blackwell was given. You can see the correction fluid alterations under proper lighting." Sheriff Thompson held the document up to the window, squinting at the obvious modifications. "This is pretty crude work. You can see where someone tried to change the name from Hartwell to Whitmore. Who had access to these family documents? James?" James's face had gone pale. "The papers were in my father's safe deposit box. I inherited access when he died 5 years ago. Thomas Chin looked up from his laptop. Sheriff, I've been cross-referencing the county records online. There's no record of any Whitmore family member ever owning this property. The title change shows Morrison family ownership from 1891 to 1994, then direct transfer to Margaret Elizabeth Hartwell. Eleanor sank deeper into her chair. But we've been paying property taxes for 30 years. Margaret nodded. Because I set up automatic payments from my personal account to cover all property expenses. Richard knew, but he preferred to let the family believe they were contributing to the household finances. David Martinez produced another folder from his briefcase. Here are 30 years of property tax payments, all from Margaret's personal banking accounts. She also paid for every major renovation and improvement to the estate. Sheriff Thompson reviewed the payment records with growing amazement. Margaret, you paid for everything? The new roof, the kitchen renovation, the pool installation? Margaret smiled sadly. Everything, Bill. Richard and I discussed it many times. He felt his family needed to maintain their sense of pride and security. I agreed because I loved him and understood his position. James finally exploded. This is insane. Why would you let us believe we own the house if you were paying for everything? Margaret's 30 years of patient silence finally gave way to honest emotion. Because, James, your family made it clear from day one that I was beneath you. A simple farm girl who got lucky marrying Richard. It was easier to maintain the peace than fight you constantly about my qualifications and contributions. Rebecca pulled out another document. Sheriff, there's also this letter Margaret wrote to Richard 6 months after their wedding. She formally granted him lifetime residence rights while retaining full legal ownership. It was a gift motivated by love, not legal necessity. Eleanor's voice came out as barely a whisper. You mean all these years, we've been living in your house as your guests? Margaret nodded. Richard understood the arrangement perfectly. He appreciated my generosity, but never forgot who actually owned the property. When he became ill last year, we discussed what would happen after his death. Sheriff Thompson closed his notebook. This seems pretty straightforward from a legal standpoint. Margaret has clear documentation of purchase and ownership. The altered documents constitute potential fraud. James, did you modify these deed copies? James's composure finally cracked completely. I found papers in Father's safe that seemed to support our ownership. Maybe I made some corrections to make them clearer. I never thought it would matter. Harrison Blackwell looked like he wanted to disappear. Mr. Whitmore, you told me those were original family documents. If you altered them before providing them to my firm, you've potentially implicated us in fraud. Sheriff Thompson stood up, his decision made. James, altering official property documents is a felony. I'm going to have to ask you to come downtown for questioning. Margaret, do you want to press charges for attempted fraud? Margaret considered for a long moment. Bill, I think James acted out of grief and desperation rather than malicious intent. But I do want it clear that any further challenges to my ownership will result in full prosecution. Rebecca gathered her documents with satisfaction. Sheriff, we'll be filing corrected estate documentation immediately. The family will need to understand that their residence here is subject to the property owner's discretion. Eleanor finally found her voice again. Margaret, what happens to us now? This has been our home for 3 decades. Margaret's tone softened slightly. Eleanor, you're welcome to remain as guests while you make arrangements for alternative housing. But the days of treating me like an outsider in my own home are over. James slumped into a chair, the weight of his actions crushing down upon him. I never meant for this to happen. I genuinely believed we owned the house. Sheriff Thompson put his hat back on. James, intent doesn't matter when it comes to document fraud. You'll need to come with me now. Margaret, if you need any further assistance with this matter, you know how to reach me. Thomas finished packing his equipment. We have everything we need to establish clear ownership and document the attempted fraud. The corrected estate filings will be submitted tomorrow morning. David Martinez shook Sheriff Thompson's hand. Thank you for your assistance, Sheriff. This could have become much more complicated without your intervention. As Sheriff Thompson led James toward the door, Eleanor called out desperately. Margaret, please. James made a terrible mistake, but he's family. Can't we work something out? Margaret watched her brother-in-law being escorted from the house he'd never actually owned. Eleanor, we'll talk tomorrow after everyone has time to process what's happened here today. But you need to understand that everything has changed now. Rebecca collected the last of her files. Margaret, You'll have full legal documentation of your ownership rights within 48 hours. No one will ever question your position again. The room fell silent except for Eleanor's quiet sobbing as she realized that 30 years of assumed privilege had evaporated in a single afternoon. The next morning brought a clarity that Margaret hadn't felt in 30 years. She stood in the kitchen making coffee while watching the sunrise paint the estate gardens in golden light. Every flower bed, every stone pathway, every carefully maintained tree represented her investment in a life she'd built with love but had never been credited for creating. Sheriff Thompson arrived at 9 sharp, accompanied by Deputy Martinez and a stack of official documents. Margaret greeted them at the front door while Eleanor watched nervously from the living room window. Bill had called the night before to explain the legal requirements for what came next. "Good morning, Margaret," Sheriff Thompson said, removing his hat respectfully. "I have the formal eviction notices as requested. Given the circumstances with the document fraud, the law requires a 48-hour notice period for the current occupants." Eleanor emerged from the living room, her usual composure replaced by exhaustion and bewilderment. She'd aged years overnight, the weight of losing her assumed security crushing her aristocratic bearing. "Sheriff, surely there's been some mistake. This is still a family matter that can be resolved privately." Sheriff Thompson's expression remained professional but firm. "Ma'am, document fraud is a criminal matter, not a family dispute. Mrs. Margaret Whitmore is the legal owner of this property and has every right to determine who resides here." Margaret accepted the official papers and reviewed them carefully. Her legal training kicked in automatically as she scanned the language and timelines. "Bill, I appreciate your thoroughness. 48 hours seems reasonable for them to gather their belongings." Eleanor's composure cracked entirely. "Margaret, please. Where am I supposed to go? I've lived in this house for 30 years. I don't have anywhere else." Margaret felt a familiar tug of sympathy, the same emotion that had allowed her to remain silent about her ownership for 3 decades. "Eleanor, you're welcome to stay in the guest house temporarily while you make permanent arrangements. But you need to understand that you're here as my guest, not as a family member with inherited rights." Deputy Martinez handed Eleanor her copy of the eviction notice. "Ma'am, you have 48 hours to remove your personal belongings from the main house. Mrs. Whitmore is being generous in offering alternative accommodation on the property." Eleanor clutched the papers with trembling hands. "What about James? What's going to happen to him?" Sheriff Thompson consulted his notebook. "Mr. Whitmore is facing charges for tampering with official documents and attempted fraud. He'll be arraigned tomorrow morning. Given his cooperation and the circumstances, he'll likely be released on bond pending trial." Margaret walked to the window overlooking the circular drive where James's car had sat for so many family gatherings. "I won't be pressing for maximum penalties, Eleanor. James made terrible decisions, but I understand he was acting from grief and desperation." The sound of vehicles approaching drew everyone's attention. 3 Blacktown cars were returning, followed by a sedan Margaret didn't recognize. Rebecca Chun emerged from the lead car with her usual professional confidence, while a distinguished older man stepped out of the sedan. Rebecca entered the foyer accompanied by the stranger, a silver-haired gentleman in an expensive charcoal suit. "Margaret, I'd like you to meet Judge Harrison Pemberton, retired from the Superior Court. He's volunteered to oversee the legal proceedings as a neutral mediator." Judge Pemberton extended his hand with judicial dignity. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've reviewed your case documentation. This is one of the most clear-cut property disputes I've encountered. Your ownership is indisputable." Eleanor looked between the judge and Margaret with growing panic. "Judge? Why do we need a judge for family matters?" Judge Pemberton's tone carried decades of courtroom authority. "Mrs. Whitmore, this ceased being a family matter when official documents were altered. We're here to ensure all legal requirements are properly fulfilled." Rebecca opened her briefcase and withdrew several thick documents. "Margaret, I have some additional information that might interest you. Our investigation into the estate matters revealed some interesting discoveries about Richard's business holdings." Margaret accepted the documents with curiosity. Richard had always handled his business affairs independently, though she'd occasionally provided legal advice when requested. "What kind of discoveries, Rebecca?" Thomas Chun emerged from one of the town cars carrying a laptop and several file boxes. "Mrs. Whitmore, It appears you own controlling interest in 3 of Richard's companies. The stock transfers were completed years ago, but never properly registered with the family. Eleanor sank into the foyer chair, her world continuing to collapse around her. What does that mean? David Martinez joined the group, carrying additional legal files. It means Margaret is the primary beneficiary of Richard's business empire, not the family trust that James assumed would inherit everything. Margaret reviewed the stock certificates with amazement. Richard had quietly transferred majority ownership to her over the years, protecting her interests in ways she'd never fully understood. The companies were worth significantly more than the estate itself. Judge Pemberton examined the business documents with professional interest. Mrs. Whitmore, you're looking at assets worth approximately $40 million in addition to this property. Sheriff Thompson whistled softly. Margaret, I had no idea you were dealing with this level of wealth. No wonder the family was so determined to maintain control. Eleanor's voice came out as barely a whisper. $40 million? But Richard always said the family businesses were struggling. Margaret looked up from the documents with understanding dawning. He protected these assets the same way he protected this property, Eleanor. Richard knew his family's tendency to assume ownership of anything within reach. Rebecca smiled with professional satisfaction. Margaret, Richard was quite clever. He structured everything to protect your interests while maintaining family harmony during his lifetime. Judge Pemberton closed his review of the documents. Mrs. Whitmore, you have several options regarding the business assets. You can maintain ownership, liquidate them, or establish a charitable foundation. Margaret considered the possibilities for a long moment. Judge Pemberton, I'd like to donate the business profits to charity. Richard would have appreciated supporting education and healthcare initiatives. Thomas looked up from his laptop. The annual profits from those companies exceed $2 million. You could fund significant charitable works with that kind of ongoing revenue. Eleanor stood up slowly, finally grasping the magnitude of what she'd lost through her family's assumptions. Margaret, we never understood. We treated you terribly, and all this time you owned everything. Margaret's response came without bitterness. Eleanor, you treated me the way you thought was appropriate for someone you considered beneath your family station. I chose to maintain peace rather than fight those battles. Sheriff Thompson prepared to leave, his official duties completed. Margaret, if you need any further assistance with this matter, please don't hesitate to call. The community has a lot of respect for what you've done over the years. Rebecca began organizing documents for final filing. Margaret, within a week you'll have complete legal documentation of all assets. No one will ever question your position again. Judge Pemberton shook hands with Margaret before departing. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm impressed by your grace under difficult circumstances. You're handling this situation with remarkable dignity. By evening, Eleanor had moved her belongings to the guest house, while Margaret reclaimed the master bedroom that had always been rightfully hers. She'd spent the afternoon making phone calls to old friends. People who'd known her before marriage transformed her into Richard's quiet wife. Dr. Patricia Hendricks arrived for dinner, followed by Rebecca Chun and several former colleagues from the law firm. Margaret had decided to host a small gathering of people who'd always treated her as an equal. Patricia raised her wine glass in the dining room that Margaret had furnished years earlier. To Margaret, who finally gets to be herself in her own home. Rebecca smiled across the table. Margaret was always the most brilliant legal mind in our firm. We're thrilled to see her reclaiming her rightful place. Margaret looked around the table at faces that reflected genuine respect and affection. For the first time in 30 years, she was entertaining as herself rather than as Richard's wife. The difference was profound and liberating. The local newspaper had picked up the story of the property dispute, though Margaret had insisted on keeping the details private. Still, word had spread through the community about the quiet widow who'd surprised everyone with her hidden legal expertise and substantial wealth. As the evening wound down and guests prepared to leave, Margaret walked through rooms that finally felt truly hers. Eleanor's light was on in the guest house, and Margaret felt no satisfaction in her former mother-in-law's reduced circumstances. She felt only the quiet peace that came from truth finally being acknowledged. Her phone rang with a call from James's attorney. He would plead guilty to misdemeanor document tampering in exchange for community service and restitution for Margaret's legal fees. The criminal matter would be resolved within months, allowing the family to begin rebuilding their lives based on reality rather than assumptions. Margaret poured herself a final glass of wine and stepped onto the terrace overlooking the gardens she'd maintained for 3 decades. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she decided how to manage her substantial assets and charitable foundation. But tonight, she was simply a woman standing in her own home, finally free to be exactly who she'd always been. The story of the quiet widow who'd owned everything all along would become local legend, a reminder that assumptions about people based on their apparent status could be dangerously wrong. Margaret had spent 30 years being underestimated, and now she'd use her reclaimed voice to ensure others were never dismissed the way she'd been. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself when people underestimated your abilities or your worth? This story really makes you think about how we judge others and how important it is to know your own value. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about times when you've had to reveal your true strength.